I'm the pleasure. Okay. I'm the pleasure to open this workshop on data indicators need for the European University Initiatives. So we are dealing with the contribution data can give us to measuring and analyzing the dynamics of an important European initiatives, the European University Initiative, and to the extent to which they can enlighten or understanding and help also to policy decision. The meeting is organized by the RISIS infrastructure project. RISIS is a large European project on data and data interoperability on research policy and higher education policy. And it's organized together with the European Tertiary Education Register, which is the reference database on higher education institution, which I'm chairing. So in this meeting, you will have first a short introduction to the topic by Andrea Bonaccorsi from the European Commission. Then we will have two round tables introduced by presentation. Sorry, there is somebody talking. Introduced by presentation from the ETHER team on some evidence, and then we will have very distinguished speakers, both from the higher education field and from data services to discuss these results. And then you will have the opportunity to interact and ask questions. Now, the usual rules of the game apply. Please mute your micro, otherwise we will mute you ourselves. You can ask questions either by posting in the chat, and then we will report the questions, or in the discussion section by raising hands. Please, when you ask questions, open your camera so that it's a bit less impersonal. And please apologize if we don't see immediately all questions. We have now 75 participants and more are joining. All this, I would like to open by giving the word to Andrea Bonaccorsi from the European Commission. He's the officer supervising the European Tertiary Education Register and many of the data tools. So he knows everything about the data strategy of the European Commission in this area. So Andrea, it's you the word.
Thank you, Benedetta. I wouldn't dare to say that I know everything about all our tools and data needs, but I'm very pleased to be joining you today for this very timely workshop that I have understood has attracted a lot of interest, which is great. My name is Andrea Bonaccorsi. I'm working for the Higher Education Unit in the Directorate General for Education and Culture. Today, I'm replacing my head of unit, Vanessa de Biessaton, who had to unfortunately cancel her participation this morning, and that asked me to represent her. So to put things a bit in context, a couple of months ago, the Council endorsed the higher education package proposed by the European Commission through the adoption of Council conclusions on the European strategy for universities and the Council recommendation on building bridges for effective European higher education cooperation. The adopted European strategy for university highlights that our society needs the contribution, obviously, of its universities more than ever. Through education, research, innovation, universities all contribute to society and economy. The ways we learn, the way we teach, the way we work are changing very fast, and universities are embracing this movement at an ever-growing pace, but the transformation of our universities needs to be accelerated, so young people are also prepared for the job of tomorrow in a fast-changing society, and to make sure that future generations are empowered to find solutions to a big societal problem that Europe and the world are facing. And this all requires a much deeper level of cooperation between universities, and that was the focus of this higher education package. The European universities are part of this package. There are 41 at the moment 41 ambitious transnational alliances of higher education institutions that are developing long-term structural and strategic cooperation. They are funded by Erasmus Plus and receiving complementary support from Horizon 2020 in the next called Horizon Europe. And these alliances really act as test beds for further innovation in the higher education sectors. They are encouraged to adopt a challenge-based approach, allowing students, academics, external partners to cooperate to tackle the biggest challenges facing Europe today. And beyond their core tasks of teaching, of research, of innovation, the universities are also key actors in Europe and become really true engines of developments for cities, for regions, to promote civic engagement, just to name a few. Each alliance is different and they all test different models of European universities alliances, respecting the diversity of the higher education landscape. And this diversity is actually a strength as it allows for choice, for creativity, for synergy through mobility, through cooperation. So this strategy has four flagships, and the first one is to broaden the European Universities Initiative to 60 European university alliances involving more than 500 higher education institutions by mid-2024. And this will come with an indicative budget totaling 1.1 billion euro from Erasmus Plus for the period 2021-2027, as well as complementary support from Horizon Europe. And broadening this initiative will encourage higher education institutions to go, something that will be on the topic today, to go even beyond existing cooperations, to reach out to new partners, to develop new types of educational provision and projects. The last Erasmus Plus call was closed on 2020, the 2nd of March, and we will present the results by the end of July. It generated a huge interest. We received about 52 proposals from across Europe and even beyond, attracting around 350 higher education institutions. And this is demonstrating that the higher education community remains intensely mobilized around this initiative. The other flagships in this higher education package include possible European legal status for alliances, a possible joint European degree, and the progressive deployment of the European Student Card Initiative. So with such an ambitious strategy, we need what the topic is today. We need reliable monitoring tools to provide information on progress achieved in the implementation of the strategy. We help to help the actors to build actions and strategies based on solid evidence and data. And the Commission is already supporting several higher education monitoring tools, such as the one co-organizing the workshop today, the Excellent ETher, the U Multirank, Euro Students, Euro Graduates, just to name a few. And they all help in their own way to gather and provide evidence to monitor our progress and to build strategies. But to rationalize the use of the different knowledge tools, to build synergies between them, and make sure that data is collected only once, the Commission has also proposed to set up a data-focused higher education sector observatory next year in 2023. And the launch of the strategy and of the higher education sector observatory will provide a unique opportunity for streamlining, for exploiting the synergies of the different existing knowledge tools that were developed over the time. The main objectives for setting up such an observatory is first to monitor the implementation of the strategy on key indicators, such as, for example, inclusion, relevance of learning outcomes, employabilities, synergies with industrial ecosystems, progress on digital and green skills, and many others. Second, to support data needs of member states and higher education institutions, upgrading the existing internal and some external data sources should, well, strengthen their intelligence on key topics for institutional transformation and adaptation of national policies. And as I mentioned, it can also streamline the data collection process and make sure it's less burdensome so for all the actors involved. And the third objective would be to promote competitiveness and attractiveness of the higher education institutions in Europe, to attract the best talents worldwide, and to strengthen the sector's performance. We hope that the observatory will enable to compare, to analyze, to showcase the higher education sector performance within Europe, their strengths, as well as to the outside world. For this, we will be very shortly launching a mapping study on data needs and availability and their possible integration in a future observatory in the coming weeks. In this context, this seminar is very timely. We will be extremely interested to know from all the participants what data needs they see emerging linked to the European University Initiative and also beyond, and what indicators they see are missing or they would like to have that are not provided at the moment in the different knowledge tools we have. And the results of this seminar will for sure contribute to this mapping study that I just mentioned, that will start in the coming weeks until run until the end of the year to prepare the setup of the observatory next year. So the objective is really to build more synergies, more interoperability, to help complement analysis, such as the one that you will be discussing today. There is clearly much more to tell on the impact of such an important initiative as the European University Initiative on different aspects and from the perspective of different tools. And there is much more to look at as well on the longer term perspective. What will be discussed today is useful to get a snapshot of what the situation is today at the start of this initiative, but we are also very interested and will need actually to have the fuller picture of what impact the initiative actually produce after several years of implementation. So for sure, the discussions will be fantastic for us to listen in. And I wish you all a good, very fruitful discussion. Many thanks for inviting us, and I'm looking forward to listen to everyone's input. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan-Mael, and you have wonderfully set the stage. So what we are discussing today in what is which evidence we already have, and if it's helpful, because that's the first proof that this data can be helpful, and to decide what we need to do in the coming years to better support policies. And now it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Andrea Bonaccorsi. Andrea was one of the founding fathers of this initiative when 20 years ago he started the totally crazy and impossible idea you could get data on European higher education institutions individually, and everybody would have said at that time it was impossible. And now you see something happened, and I think we can be proud of what happened in the last 20 years. So I give you the word for the first session of this workshop.
Thank you, Benedetto. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andrea Bonaccorsi. I'm a professor of economics and management at the University of Pisa, and actually one of the founders of the European Tertiary Education Register, which is now a reference point for officially validated data based on micro analysis of higher education institutions. Within the current ETHER initiative, I'm responsible for a couple of seminars with policymakers and actors of the European education, higher education landscape, and this is the first one. It's a remarkable initiative because the European University Initiative, as we have been told just now by Jan-Mael, is one of the flagship initiatives and will grow over time. So the webinar today is aimed at discussing the data already available and the data missing, and also missing indicators that we need to produce and work about in the future to follow the long-term evolution of the higher education landscape in Europe. After my short presentation, there will be the first round table. I just start to introduce to you the speakers, highly distinguished, that we have invited, and let me take the opportunity to thank them warmly for having accepted immediately to join us in this conversation. Michael Murphy, who is the president of the European University Association, Ben Jungblad, who is at the Center of Higher Education Policy Studies, CEPS, and Sebastian Stride at CERIS Academic in Spain. With these three people, we will discuss the preliminary evidence we have on Ether data, while there will also be a second presentation that will discuss mainly the formation of alliances, and I will tell you about our distinguished guest after the first roundtable. We have planned to work mainly with a talk that is, I only will use a few slides, but then we will have conversation. And after that, we plan to leave enough space for you. We are now 98, so we also will tell you when we achieve 100 to participate, either by microphone or by chat. Okay. So if you see my presentation, and very simply, we want to share with you some of the data we have available in the Ether data set. Okay. Ether, as you know, is a collection of microdata on European higher education institutions. It covers both universities and non-university higher education institutions, and is now the reference point because almost all national statistical authorities in Europe and beyond, including also associated countries, deliver their data on an annual basis. They refer to individual institutions. In the context of Ether, what we did is to extract the data that refer to the first 41 alliances, and we have 292 universities, and compare them to those universities that are non-members to get a preliminary analysis of similarities and differences. To make the comparison more rigorous, we only examine universities, that is PhD granting institutions. And we will ask 4 very simple questions that we can address by means of Ether data, that is by means of micro data that are validated at the level of individual institutions. So first, question 1, do we see a different size? So are members of alliances larger or smaller or equal to non-members? Second, do they have a different disciplinary profile? That is, do we see more technical universities or business schools or medical schools or whatever kind of a specialization, or even a different mix between disciplines in members versus non-members? Number 3, do we have any evidence about differences in research orientation, which here we measure in terms of the intensity of PhD students out of the total student population? And finally, do we see differences in terms of the degree of internationalization of the student population? They may seem relatively simple indicators, but as you will see, they deliver us a very interesting picture. First of all, sides, we are able to calculate the average number of academic staff and students for universities that are members of the alliance or non-members. This data will also be published in a RISIS policy brief that you can easily download from the RISIS website. So I'm just showing the data that are already discussed in this policy brief. As you can see, that the most complete coverage of data in ETHER is given by students, and where we have a full and complete coverage. With respect to staff, we have some missing situation, in particular on the calculation of full-time equivalent. What do we get from this analysis? Very clearly, members of alliances are significantly larger. More than 2,000 academic staff in head count, as opposed to 800, and 23,000 students as opposed to 15,000. So first point, we see a larger size for universities that are currently members of the 41 alliances in Europe. Second problem, second question, do we see disciplinary differences? Now, ETHER data are very rich in terms of the breakdown of student population by field of education. Field of education are standardized definitions that cut across all international classification, so we can calculate a variety of measures. What I did is very simply to divide in two areas. On one side, SSH, social sciences and humanities, and the other side, on the other side, an extended definition of STEM that does not only include science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but also agricultural and forestry sciences, and also medicine, health and welfare. Now, we calculate the total number here, the total number of students by field of education, and we compare this total population. And what we find here is that the percentage of STEM, of extended STEM, is roughly the same, either in undergraduate student population or in the PhD student population. So number two, universities in alliance do not differ in terms of subject mix. That is, the initiative has been able to attract universities across the spectrum of disciplinary specialization or disciplinary generalist model. Number three, research orientation. Again, in ETHER, we don't have data on publications that, however, could be easily integrated based on the standardized affiliation and disambiguation. But we have an officially validated number, that is the number of PhD students, and the ratio between PhD students and undergraduate students, or if you want, out of total student population, is a measure that is used in academic research on research intensity. But before doing this, it is also interesting to know that by this period, the total number of PhD students that are enrolled at universities that are part of alliances is larger than the number of PhD students outside alliances. So that's another interesting point. PhD population in Europe already is engaged into the long-term transformation that Yamael mentioned in his opening speech. That is, that already this opportunity. And in terms of intensity, members of Alliance have 5.8% of PhD students out of undergraduate, which is more than double the non-members of alliances. And finally, what about internationalization? Ether data record very carefully the presence of foreign students in terms of whether they had their higher education diploma in a different country. That's another very powerful source of data to study the internationalization of universities in terms of flows, and also to locate these phenomena across different national countries, or for example, size and border, of course, of these countries. For the time being, we just calculate the share of foreign students out of total student population. We already note again that the total number of foreign students is larger in universities that are members of alliances in total, as you can see. And if you measure a ratio between foreign students and total student population, again, members of alliances have a more international student population. Where do we move from this analysis? We could do many refinements, which are not in the policy brief. It could be done in the near future. At geographic level, we could cover country, region, or even other geographic or institutional differences. We could also do more in terms of intra-alliance analysis, studying the internal diversity, studying also integration with other data, Erasmus, Cordis, publication, funding, and also to integrate with self-description of alliances. To show you the potential of this analysis, I am taking the benefit to quote some slides from Sebastian's slide. I thank him for sharing with me about work that they are doing by combining ether data with other data. This is an analysis at the level of individual alliances. This is an analysis in which you can go into the self-description of alliances to study their cloud of words or other topic modeling techniques. And that is another analysis in which you can examine each alliance in terms of integration between ether data and the data that are provided in the alliance official documentation. So there is a large opportunity to combine ether data with other sources of data and to address the data needs. So to sum up, members of alliances for the time being are larger, more internationalized, more oriented towards research, but however, do not differ at all in the subject mix and disciplinary profile. Now, for the distinguished speakers in the roundtable, first, how do we interpret this evidence on differences, but also on similarities between universities that are members and non-members? Second, if you were asked to evaluate the initiative, as we have been challenged to think about, in terms of several policy goals, which kind of data and indicators would you require? So let me stop the sharing of my slides. In the chat, you can get immediately the address of the policy brief. We are now 99, so the next one will be celebrated. And I immediately open the roundtable, asking Professor Michael Murphy to take the microphone.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. And the first thing I've done in the course of your presentation is to tear up my script. I have had a lot of background stuff here, which I'm now going to summarize very briefly and then specifically address your questions. So the first thing to say is that we're very grateful at EUA to have been invited today. We've worked with ETER over the years, Thomas Esterman on your advisory committee, and we also helped disseminate knowledge about ETER, very happy to do so. And we find your work very valuable in the sense that it complements data that we collect about the performance of our system over the years. And I hope that our data will complement yours as well, because ETER is a very important tool for policymakers. Now, I'll scrap the next piece of my script just to highlight for 1 or 2 minutes an important point, and that is to draw attention to data that we collect on the system that you should be aware of, because a key point from this discussion today will be the importance of bringing all the data into one place for efficiency and for transparency. So just to update you on something known to most of you, probably, our Autonomy Scorecard. It provides important information on the conditions under which universities work, and particularly the conditions which will influence collaboration and the success of the European University Initiative. The scorecard is currently being updated after 6 years, and we have included this time questions on the alliances and their impact. I'm happy to say there is some evidence that the regulatory framework across Europe is showing signs of adaptation. Flanders have now allowed the use of more English in providing courses, which should be helpful. And Hungary has also been updating its accreditation process in response to this. I share this information with you so that it can enter into the collective thinking in the coming years. I also draw quickly attention to our work on the governance of universities within the alliances, which is throwing up some challenges that we will have to address. And lastly, our Public Funding Observatory collects a lot of information on the availability of funding and the diversity of that funding across systems. That is also relevant. And finally, just to draw your attention to another project that we are engaged in, which is called New Lead, which is evaluating the development of university leadership capacity across Europe. Again, critical to this entire endeavor, because the alliances are really dependent on competent leadership in our universities, leaders that are engaged with the internationalization agenda. Now, to your specific questions, having done a lot of summarizing of a longer script, can I say this, that it comes as no surprise to us that universities participating in the initiative are larger, because we know that this type of collaboration requires an enormous effort in terms of resources and broad institutional engagement. And that doesn't make sense often for smaller institutions. The participating universities are 3 times larger in terms of academic staff numbers. But if you go further, and if you look at the student-staff ratio among non-participants, it's 23:1. Among participants, it's 12:1. So that you can probably surmise that the available staff resource is greatly bigger, and the time available for staff to engage in this complex initiative is much greater in the participating institutions. That is no surprise. On research intensity, I don't think there's any surprise here either, because research-intensive institutions have had much greater opportunity to partner over the decades. The research framework programs have dwarfed, their budgets have dwarfed those in Erasmus, for example. And so there's a greater incentive, and has been a greater incentive, for the research-intensive institutions to collaborate. And thus they have a first mover advantage, a lot of experience. And I might make a comment on passing, and that is in your briefing paper, where you embedded the data you just showed us, you made a comment in quotes, "While the initiative is mainly devoted to strengthening the European higher education area, it will immediately benefit the European research area," close quotes. And in a sense, when I read that sentence, it for me emphasized in a sense the absurdity of the segregation of those two areas. Because in the university sector, we live and we operate in an integrated space. research, innovation, education. They're all part of our mission spectrum. And in a sense, the fact that one is making the comment that you made in a way, it emphasizes the failure to integrate bureaucracies within the Commission rather than responding to a demand from society. That's a comment en passant. We take the view that there are no differences in disciplines, and that is a good thing. And on internationalization, it's clear that it only makes sense for institutions that have already got a high degree of internationalization to engage in this very complex form of international collaboration. The institutions that are participating with more resources, a deeper experience of managing the challenges of internationalization, again, they will have been better prepared to join the initiative. It's a big strategic decision for a university to engage in an alliance. Where the university is large and experienced, it's easy. But where there is already a history of strong partnerships, it's been easier to engage. Just drawing your attention to data there, again in 2020, we conducted a survey of universities across Europe. We had over 300 responses, which showed, of course, that international partnerships are not new. There is much experience of them. The scale has generally been smaller than that seen here in the EUI. And so that raises questions from the university side as to whether it makes sense to have so many partners from so many different diverse systems involved in individual alliances. Will this actually make success rather difficult into the future? It's a question. So their initial comments on your questions. I have one last comment to share, and that is in the data that was circulated. I saw slides that will appear later, and I now see that there are 42 new EUAs created in describing this initiative. And can I say that as the organization that is the first and only one to come up when you Google the term EUA, we would be happier if some other abbreviation were used to describe the groupings. That probably comes as a surprise or from left field, but it is a comment I'm making. So that's the initial view from EUA, and I'll be interested to hear the view from other partners in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, and also for the final comments and the surprise. That's something that makes our meeting lively. Thank you, Ben Youngblood, please.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Yeah, my name is Ben Youngblood. I work at a Center for Higher Education Policy Studies at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. And I think the reason I was asked to contribute to this roundtable is that because CHEPS, where I work, is very much involved in EU multi-rank, which is an adventure that is also sponsored by the European Commission. It provides a lot of comparable data on individual higher education institutions, just like the ITER database. And the data that was shown to us about the European University Alliances can indeed be based on data in the ITER database. But I would say there's big advantages also of combining that data with data from EU multi-rank, because EU multi-rank is very much focusing on performance elements in higher education. And so that would be my message, that we should explore or exploit the linkage or the integration of those two databases. And we are working on that already. I must say we are, as CHEPS and our other partners in the EU multi-rank project, are already integrating the two databases using what we call an institutional identifier to link the data, so that we can easily get an integrated database combining ITER data and EU multi-rank data. And yeah, the message of my present contribution is that what was shown to us already in the slides by Andrea Bonaccorsi is that the data from ITER, I mean, it's very rich and useful and powerful, but I think it's mostly focusing on input data, on characteristics, on resources, perhaps staff, student numbers, and that sort of data. But if you combine that with multi-ring data, you can get a richer picture of the diversity of the higher education institutions, the ones in the alliances, as well as the ones that are not in the alliances. And when I talk about diversity, I heard Jan Mael talk about diversity being a strength. I would certainly support that, of course. But diversity is more than just taking a look at the averages of the group of higher education institutions that are part of the alliances and the group that are outside of the alliances. I mean, there's more to diversity than just averages. I think you should try, when we go further in this analysis, look at other measures of dispersion and look at the variety within the alliances. Indeed, that was mentioned already by Andrea, but also look at the differences between members of the alliances and members and non-members outside of the alliances. There are indeed rich data to be used from ITER. Data was already shown by Andrea on disciplinary profile and age or size of the institutions and international aspects. But it struck me, and I didn't realize that the data that was shown by Andrea is referring to data only from PhD granting institutions. That I found a bit strange, because we are now comparing the European University Alliances institutions with the ones that are also already quite research intensive. I would think that there is more to the European higher education diversity than the universities that provide or offer PhD degrees. So I think that would be an opportunity to explore further, also involve in the comparison institutions that are not granting PhD degrees. So what I was asked to do is answer those two questions that were given to us by Andrea Bonaccorsi. So what can the data tell us about differences between the two groups, the groups of alliances and the non-members, let's say, non-members that do provide PhD degrees? Well, we've seen a bit of data on the size and on the subject mix, but I think there's also more to subject mix than just the difference between STEM programs and non-STEM programs. I think there is more rich data in the ITER database as well as in the multi-ring database that can give us a better picture, I think, of the disciplinary coverage of the alliance members versus the members versus the institutions that are outside of the alliance. So subject mix can be analyzed through additional indicators, I would think. And there's more data in ITER, data on the age of the institutions, data on the location of the institutions, so in what countries are the institutions located. And that has not been shown to us so far, but I'm sure that can be later on also added to that policy, or what is it called, that paper that we were referred to, the briefing paper. So the ITER data is rich, but it can give us a better picture of diversity, I think, than just looking at averages. And so we could look at data about the differences between those two groups, but we could also look at data about the differences within the alliances, because the alliances are quite heterogeneous. So they are all having different goals. Of course, they are the goals that are sort of suggested by the European Commission, but the goals, if you look at the alliances, are quite different. So if you would answer that second question that was given to us by Andrea, what data do we need when we were to evaluate those alliances? You would have to take into account that the alliances have different goals, and the types of goals would have to be reflected in in the evaluation, of course. You cannot just evaluate the alliances on the basis of a uniform set of data or indicators. You have to evaluate them in light of their mission, in light of the goals that the alliances have. And then you would, of course, would also be interested in comparing those alliances with institutions that are not in an alliance, to see whether the European subsidy that was given to the alliance has indeed made a difference in their performance over the years that they have had the alliance. And so that immediately leads to quite big methodological questions. The evaluation question is a very, very difficult question methodologically, because you have to first determine what is the performance, if I might use that word. What is it that the institutions have achieved using the subsidies that they generated from the European funds, national funds, etc. So what have they achieved? That's a question. And then the next question is that achievement, is it fully based on the fact that they are working together in an alliance, or is that performance, is that more or less the sum of the individual members' performance? So that's also a quite difficult methodological question. And then on top of that, you can ask the question, when do we have to start measuring that performance? I mean, it takes a bit of time for results or impact to show up, of course. So I would think that's also a very difficult question to address. So evaluating the alliances has to be done in light of the emissions of the alliances. It has to be done also by trying to find a sensible group of institutions that can be compared to that alliance. And then once again, I have to refer to multi-rank, because multi-rank is a tool that is meant to indeed compare performances across institutions, but in a way that performance is done is measured against a set of comparators that are similar to the institution. So you have to compare like with like when it comes to performance, because the missions of institutions are very different. And we've already heard that the Fachhochschulen, or the University of Applied Sciences, are much less involved in the alliances. And so it does not make sense to include them in a comparison, of course. But there are, I would think, at least in the next round of the alliances, institutions that are perhaps not so much PhD oriented or research oriented and still are part of an alliance. So you have to compare them to a sensible group of institutions. So yeah, so my message is, well, try and explore the availability of the existing databases that we have. I only mentioned multi-rank, but there are, of course, many more databases that we can hopefully later on integrate and link to each other to get a better picture of what is it that is offered and what is it that is provided and performed by the European universities, including the ones that are not part of an alliance. So the databases are there. The question is now to link them together and to try to find them a way of doing that. And we've heard the representative of the Commission saying that there's an initiative now on the way to set up an observatory of the European universities or the European higher education sector. So in that observatory would, in the next few years, then work on that integration of databases using things like a common institutional identifier. And we can think of integrating in that observatory also data from not just multi-rank and ITER and other places, but also perhaps integrate more qualitative data. And I was indeed struck by one of the slides that was shown where we've seen a word cloud that suggests that there's also qualitative data that can be used for comparing higher education institutions. So that could also be an opportunity for the future when we are asked to evaluate these higher education alliances, including more qualitative data. So I think I'll leave it here, Andrea, and pass on the microphone to you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. As expected, there are many issues on the table. Thank you for adding new dimensions of work. Sebastian Stride, please take.
Thanks, Andrea. Great. So I'm going to build a bit on what Ben was saying about comparing like with like, and try to make 3 points about the use of data to analyze alliances, and maybe finish with a simple but probably difficult to implement recommendation. So first, data tends to benefit the wealthy. And I think Michael made the point perfectly well. For smaller alliances, it was much harder to prepare a proposal. They were not used to working together on strategic projects. They had little to no previous collaborations, either in research or in education. And writing an application required far more work and investment, yet they had less resources. This is a very serious point, because data such as co-publication networks actually can easily lead to favor prestigious institutions. And one of the things which struck us when we were exploring the data, and Andrea showed a couple of maps, was that if you take the 6 most prestigious, largest European university initiatives with 7,000 European projects, they only have 12% of universities from Eastern Europe. Yet if you take the 6 smallest European university initiatives with just 70 European projects in total, they have 44% of Eastern European universities. So that's the first point. The second one is that a one-size-fits-all approach does not work for data or for alliances. Prestigious institutions are already part of a multitude of networks. Setting up research projects or privileged student exchanges within a single alliance makes little sense to them. So the rectors of these universities publicly support the European University Initiative, but they do not actively promote it within their institutions because it actually brings little added value for their staff or students. For them, European university initiatives are mostly a political tool, and they look to the Shanghai ranking when building their alliance and when looking for data, not to ETHER. Their mission is ensuring that Europe is competitive with the US or with China. On the contrary, when you look at alliances between institutions with less prestige, these can be truly transformative. So I'll take just one example. The European University of Technology actually aim for full merger. If this were to succeed, and of course it's a very big if, then this would radically improve their students' and staff's perspective. It would open new perspectives for their region and have a massive impact on European integration. To succeed, they need data to track their progress, identifying blocking points and best practices, and enable an ever deeper process of integration. In other words, they need data over consistent data over 5 to 10 years and strong internal analytical capacities. And this is a completely different approach to data. And third, comparing data requires shared semantics. And in Europe, this is a massive problem. Comparing the official budget of a university in which half the staff are employed by a national research organization and which does not own its real estate, as is often the case in some countries, with one that does is meaningless. Comparing student outcomes in countries where the results of the National Student Survey are public, like the Netherlands, with those of countries where student surveys do not exist, is difficult to say the least. And comparing results between a university that considers that a declaration of intention by a student is enough to count as a startup with one where startups are only taken into account when they have 100,000 of finance is pointless. So these 3 comments lead to a general proposal, which is that I feel that we need a two-track European University Initiative approach. One called focused more on collaboration that allows universities to be members of many alliances, with each alliance potentially open to dozens of members and focused on specific topics, but which is not restrictive. And a second approach, restricted to a more integrative transformational alliance that concerns the institution as a whole and aims to replace existing structures and processes, and eventually universities, by an integrated European level ones. And if we look at this in terms of data, in the first case, classical data sets such as collaboration or student flows can be used to evaluate and compare performance. In the second, existing evaluation mechanisms are of little relevance because the resulting structures would, by definition, be truly integrated institutions requiring recurrent funding based on non-competitive mechanisms. And in the meantime, and I'll finish here, and in more pragmatic fashion, valid for both cases, it's important to repeat 2 points. Data is only useful if it can be compared, and this requires aligning the semantics of higher education at a European scale. And secondly, comparison is most useful internally within each European university in order to detect best practices, track strategic operational progress and performance in a customized manner. It is counterproductive if it is used to compare standardized performance expectations between European universities, and even more so if it were used to evaluate them. And I'll stop there.
Okay, Sebastian, thank you. You are adding another dimension of complexity to our discussion. Thank you. I will not comment for the time being. We are lucky because we have time for extended interaction. We asked our speakers, and I really thank them for being very sharp and condensate a lot of comments in less than 10 minutes. So we have time to open the floor and ask contributions. So first hand I see is Emily Palmer. Emily, take the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. My name's Emily Palmer. I'm the Secretary General of Una Europa, one of the first alliances funded under the European Universities Initiative, and we'll be speaking on the next panel, which I don't want to jump to, of course, but I'm very interested by some of the remarks of the last speaker in particular. And so I think it's very interesting to think about the purposes of the European Universities Initiative, and perhaps this hasn't been fully defined, but it's a question of, are European universities an end in itself, meaning that we're moving towards really mergers and European institutions, or are we rather looking towards the European Universities Initiative as a means to raise the overall competitiveness and quality of higher education in Europe vis-a-vis the rest of the world? And from Una Europa's perspective, it would certainly be the latter. And of course, our institutions are looking to collaborate with the US and China and Africa and all parts of the world. But indeed, we believe that the European Universities Initiative can be a way to leverage that discussion on global scale, because if you look to the very big partners, East and West, they're very much bigger than the small countries that we have in Europe. So it's in joining forces that we indeed can build that leverage and work towards more competition. So I was very interested in your contributions, but I felt it was important to contribute that viewpoint, because I think, yeah, the overall goal of the European Universities Initiative should perhaps be further discussed if we're looking to it as an end in itself or as a means to a goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. I see another hand, Ludovic Tilly, please.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Ludovic Tilly, the chair of the Coimbra Group and coordinator of the EC2 Alliance. I will also be a speaker of the next panel. So just like Emily, I don't want to really discuss what will be the topic, but actually I was about to react exactly as Emily, because in particular, Sebastian, when you basically propose two types of alliances, basically what I recognize is the first type are more or less the existing large-scale networks, such as the Coimbra Group, EUA, and many others, where basically indeed we have a variety of interactions, and there is, let's say, sort of a mutual understanding and trust that has built with time. And these type of, let's say, high-level interactions have usually led to the creation of the new type, which is very much focused, complementary to the large-scale networks. But there we have the alliances which have a clear purpose, a potential of very systemic impact on the higher education and research landscape. And these are, to my understanding, what we are talking about when we speak on the European Universities Initiative. So in a way, what you described is, I believe, already what we have now on the scene, but maybe that's just a personal opinion.
Okay, thank you very much, Ludovic. Maybe we can, let me check on the chat whether we have all addresses of all documents. Thank you. Okay, let's start some reaction. Sebastian, please.
Yeah, no, so I don't disagree with what Emilie and Ludovic were commenting. It's really an observation on an evolution of an object which we don't know. No one knows where it's headed towards. And in a way, it's looking at the way different European universities are using data to move forward. And to take a simple comparison, you clearly have European universities where it makes sense in medicine to be collaborating with some institution, in mathematics with others, and very deeply. And this is something which is natural for researchers, and it's more a bottom-up approach. And in those institutions, attempts for more institutional level collaboration rarely seem to be working. Whereas when you're in smaller institutions, just the fact of having this possible new collaborations can be transformative in the way they're organized, in the best practices they can learn, in what they can implement. So maybe it's a midway between the Coimbra and the European University Initiatives, which I'm looking at in most cases. So simply for them not to be closed, for them to be more open. And there are some cases, to give one example, as you probably have followed, Leiden University is currently member of 2 initiatives. And so there's always this question of you can be a full member or part member, or what is the exact status. But there are many other cases where universities would feel more comfortable with various partners. Whereas you have other institutions where they're really, and if I'm looking at it at the data level, what they're talking about is the fact that they will set up their data management structures at the European university level, not within the individual institutions. And that is a step change. And so they're really looking at understanding each process, not as an additional layer, but as taking the place of existing processes and ways of looking at data within their institutions. And in some cases, this is very, very powerful because they're often institutions which precisely have weak data capacities internally. And so this is an excuse, a way to build something which they didn't have previously.
Thank you, Sebastian. May I ask Michael and Ben to react on these first comments? Michael, please.
Very good comments and a very stimulating talk, Sebastian, if I might say so, following on an equally stimulating talk by Ben. Now, here's a point. The overall objective has to be better performance by individual universities in Europe and the collective universities of Europe in contributing to global knowledge and education. A stronger Europe. Now, interestingly, we seem to be taking a different approach to that being taken by the US and China, for example, or India in its aspirations, its policy aspirations, in that we are pursuing the concept of distributed excellence, contrasted with investment in small numbers of elite institutions. And I think this is probably driven by an analysis that the American model has been a significant contributor to societal inequality in the United States, and furthermore, onto political dysfunctionality. We are committed to ensuring that all parts of Europe are successful. So now that means that we've decided to go a different route, and we've got to demonstrate that we are actually achieving our goals by that route. To me, it's the most important data are those that actually measure performance of universities and can detect change in performance in universities. And for this program, there is a necessity to be able to demonstrate that this type of program per se is contributing positively. So if I were putting on my medical hat, worn for 25 years, I would, of course, ideally have had a randomized controlled trial where I would have randomly assigned universities categorized by the nature of their priority missions. But of course, we can't do that. But I would certainly ask those who have the databases to look at the reality that not all institutions in the different segments of the mission spectrum are in this program, and we have data on them. So I would like to see an analysis at the end of, say, 3 years, perhaps using the multi-rank framework, because for me, that is the gold standard. Currently, it can be improved and has lots of evolution ahead of it. But if we could just take those, an examination of the change in performance over the 3 to 4 year period among Europe's universities participating and not participating in this program, because that's just ultimately will be the justification for adhering to distributed excellence as our policy goal.
Thank you, Michael. Ben, do you have any additional comment on this?
Yeah, there's a lot has been said already, but the first question was about the purpose of this whole initiative, of course, and I cannot answer for the Commission, but I think what we have to be careful about is that the purposes are many, and there's many different objectives that this initiative strives to encourage, and not all alliances can manage to achieve all of the objectives that the European Commission initiative has set out. So that's why that was my point in my intervention. The alliances are all quite different in terms of their goals and missions. And what Michael just said is, and I support that, is you have to compare the alliances in light of that mission and compare them with other, let's say, groups or sets of institutions that have a sort of equal mission. Otherwise, you cannot make a sensible comparison of the changes in performance. And to complicate things a little bit further, I mean, we just now talking about the purposes of this initiative from the side of the European Commission, but in between the institution and the European Commission, there's the national level. And some countries have decided that they want to embrace this initiative and put their national resources into this initiative on top of the European resources to push this further. So that comes with additional objectives, additional expectations. So you have to keep that in mind as well, that some national governments are supporting financially this initiative, and some countries do not. I mean, currently there are about 7, maybe 8 countries that do not provide any national support for the alliances. And some other countries, like particularly Germany and France, they put lots of national resources in the alliances. That also determines to some extent the degree to which the alliances can achieve their purposes. And you have to keep that in mind, including that the things that Michael mentioned in his first intervention, that there's different types of different levels of autonomy in the countries that we look at, and that also has an impact on what the alliances achieve. And yeah, so that's what I'd like to state on top of what has already been said, which was already making sense to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. So we are now at the core of the discussion about the goal and the performance. So I'd like to ask other people. I see a few comments on chat. So Pin the Bear, would you like to join us on the microphone? You left a very long comment from the Aurora perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's always a bit difficult to explain what Aurora is. I'm representing Aurora in Brussels. And this also deals with, well, also what Ludovic mentioned between alliances and association membership associations. So on the one hand, there are the associations. They are dealing most often not necessarily with scientific themes, so the content of science, but rather on the other topics. And for the alliance, well, there are two aspects. One aspect is the education part, and the other aspect is the research and innovation aspect. For the education aspect, collaboration is not that difficult, probably because the competition is a bit lower as compared to research and innovation. But for research and innovation, for instance, our deans, or others would say vice rectors, it's a bit difficult to say, okay, you're going to collaborate with these universities within the alliance. That doesn't work. So, well, we were not allowed to write any proposal on that part. So we had to shift to the, well, let's say the non-scientific part of the proposal. And that's the research support. So we started as a legal network, an association in 2016 to learn from each other, to collaborate, but also to get better individually and together. And then the opportunity of the European university networks appeared. So yeah, okay, we got both of the grants. The situation was, okay, it's both Aurora, so why not merge it? So for communication purposes, they merged it, but now it appears after 1 year, okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't fit. So we try to separate it again into a network, which is more loosely collaboration, and also, well, leaving the possibility to collaborate with other parts in the world, and the alliance, which is, yeah, well, you work on projects. So in the end, well, I see it as a metaphor like the human body. The network is acting as a skeleton and the brain, so providing the strategy and the vision, and the projects are acting as the organs, the flesh and the blood, and one cannot do without the other, though the skeleton still exists after death. So yeah, there's some kind of movement, and that's what I try to explain in the text. So it's not that easy to go, well, forward with data like those have been presented.
Okay, thank you. We had some noise on the voice, but I think we got the main message. You distinguish between network and alliance in terms of incentives and governance structures. So you introduce another dimension for our discussion. Thank you. May I check whether there are other contributions from the floor? Raising their hand. Again, read the chat if you have time, because you find other clarifications from the speakers. Okay. Okay. That's all. Okay, so we used part of our slot for questions and answers. The next roundtable will be more crowded, because we will have four speakers. I will not do any summary or any comment for the time being. I have time at the end with Benedetto to try to take on board most of the comments and suggestions you did, and you already touched a number of very crucial issues in terms of goals, performance, and related data needs and indicator needs. So we are already on a very good path to the goals of our webinar. So I would like to move to the next roundtable, which will be introduced by a presentation by Marco Cavallaro and Agata Lambrechts from the University of Lugano, the Università della Svizzera Italiana. They will present in progress research work on the dynamics of alliance formation. And their data, as well as the other data we discussed in the first roundtable, will be commented by the second roundtable with our distinguished guests. The first one will be Karen Max, the chair of LERU, the League of European Research Universities, followed by Gabi Lombardo, who is the director of the European Alliance for Social Science and the Humanities, followed by Ludovic Tilly, coordinator of the European Campus of Cities Universities and chair of the Coimbra Group, and finally by Emily Palmer, the Secretary General of UNA, European Representative for EU1. Which you already have seen on the screen in our debate. So again, we will have time after the discussion to ask questions, and we'll be in perfect time to conclude our webinar. So I will give the floor to Marco and Agata, so they can share the screen.
Thank you, Andrea. Georg, I can't share.
One second.
Thank you.
I'll share for you.
You're sharing for me, okay. Thank you. Following on the presentation by Andrea and the discussion that we just had, Marco and myself, and we are both involved in the work of ETER at the coordinating partner institution in Switzerland. We'll present some of our ongoing work as another conversation starter for the second half of this working meetings. And we hope to learn as much, if not more, from the panel speakers and the audience about the data needs and the potential, as you will hopefully learn from us. On the next slide, I've got the presentation structure. Interestingly, because our work is actually independent, but as Andrea's policy brief suggested, for someone to look into the internal dynamics of alliance formation in the first wave of the 2 pilot phases, and then later on the results of the current call, we have done exactly that. So hopefully it will be interesting for you to see our results. On the next slide, I've got at the top the aim of our research. So we want to find out how we can use ETER data combined with other data sets to characterize the existing alliances. And then based on those observable characteristics, what can we infer about the underlying mechanisms for formation of alliances? And 2 caveats here. We are talking obviously about the 41 alliances which have been funded through the scheme. We know that 116 applications were received, but we are only observing how the alliances which received funding have been formed. And then we hypothesize about the mechanisms as outsiders to the process. We haven't actually talked to those who were involved in setting up the alliances, but we are aware of work like this being completed at the University of Oslo, and we are looking forward to their fundings, which will give us a fuller picture, we hope. And we agree with the statements made before that there are limits to how the existing data can be used to evaluate and monitor the performance of alliances in relation to their internal, but also the top-level objectives and priorities. But we know that some colleagues commissioned to do exactly that by the European Commission are here today as well and listening to our discussions. On the next slide, I've got a brief summary of the mechanisms, the theoretical framework for our studies. So we borrow here the ideas from sociology and management because, as mentioned before, the cooperation of higher education institutions, of course, long precedes the European University Initiative. But the formation of inter-firm alliances in the private sector has been more widely studied before. So we identified 3 observable mechanisms. First, similarities, so the tendency for alliances or close networks to be formed by organizations which are similar to each other in some respects. We can talk about, for example, reputation or values, but also age, size, geographical position, or the social environment. Secondly, as already mentioned in the discussion and before as well, organizations are more likely to work with those with whom they already have ties, so whom they can trust because they have history of exchange of information, and that reduces risks and costs associated with search for suitable partners. And finally, the complementarity, which is said to be most common and leading to most successful outcomes in the private sector by creating more innovation and greater value. And to achieve complementarity, organizations must find partners that are in some ways different from their own, to exchange resources and complementary capabilities. And we expected to observe a mix of the 3 mechanisms, but aimed to identify which is the predominant one or which of the 3 may most often operate in tandem. Now I'll pass the floor to Marco for the next few slides.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, to find out about this mechanism in the frame within the frame of the European University Initiative, so far we use both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So to characterize the alliances, we use the ETER-based classification of higher education institutions. I will come back to this in a few seconds. And so to analyze the network ties, we consider 3 types of ties: the research ties, which consist of the intensity of collaboration in Horizon 2020 within an alliance, and We have also education ties, which is the intensity of student exchanges in the frame of Erasmus Plus within an alliance. And we also look into the institutional ties, which is the membership of partner universities in pre-existing alliances like LERU, the Guild, Coimbra Group, and others. But not everything can be explained by quantitative data. So this is why we also analyze content from alliances publicly available documentation to see what the alliances themselves consider as the basis for their compatibility. Yeah, I'm just trying to go to the next slide, but I don't manage. Ah, yeah. Ah. Yeah, perfect. Sorry, it killed the suspense a bit. So concerning the classification of higher education institutions, so we use the classes that have been identified by Professor Benedetto Lepori in a published work, and thanks to the ITER dataset. You can see here 6 classes. So we have, first of all, the research universities, which are multidisciplinary universities with rather large research output. We have science-oriented universities that also have a high research output, but they are more oriented towards STEM and medical disciplines. We have generalists, which are middle-sized institutions that are more oriented towards social sciences and humanity, and with an average research intensity. And we have also applied science university, which most of do not award PhDs and are oriented towards STEM disciplines. We also have small institutions that are specialized in social sciences and humanities, such as academies of arts and music or business schools. And the last class, the educational ones, which do not award PhDs and do not have or have a rather low research output. Now this quite simplified explanation allows us to go straight to the composition of the alliances based on these classes that I've just described. So on the figure, you can barely see the class composition of each of the 41 alliances. But in a few words, we found out that about 3/4 of the alliances are composed of 1 or 2 classes, which leads us to think that their member institutions have a certain degree of similarities when it comes to the level of research output or subject specialization. Some of the alliances are fully composed or mostly composed of the research universities. So you can see the red on the figure. So these are the multidisciplinary ones with a large research output. We can also see alliances like Eurotech or ELISA that are specialized in engineering and that are, of course, mostly composed of STEM-oriented universities. There are also others that are mostly composed of generalists, so more social science oriented, like Civica. And but also 12 of these alliances have 3 or more classes that are represented. So we consider this as having perhaps higher levels of heterogeneity, at least when it comes to the level of research output and subject specialization. And so the analysis of the alliance's official documents largely corroborates the quantitative results, but also reveals details that are not visible at the quantitative level. So here we have identified 13 different axes of connection. The most commonly cited was the first one that you see here, the subject orientation. So most alliances do not have a specific thematic focus and offer a comprehensive range of education opportunities. While others, they focus on specific themes and disciplines such as arts, brain research, engineering, global health, etc. And while the majority of the alliances described their subject orientation as a similarity, the 5 of them emphasize explicitly about the complementarities of their disciplinary focus. And some members of the alliances have also similar geographical characteristics, such as their location in medium-sized cities or rural or mountain regions. So we will just come back to the geographical aspects in a few minutes. But all in all, so 34 of the alliances mention explicitly similarities as the basis of their compatibility. 24 refer to some complementarities, while 19 report previous collaborations or shared membership in other networks. So speaking of past collaboration, we can now look into the research and education ties. So we have this graph on the right. So here the horizontal axis represents the intensity of collaboration within alliances in Horizon 2020. The vertical axis is the intensity of students exchange within alliances in Erasmus+. And very important here when you see the graph, so to avoid size effects. So the number of collaboration and exchanges have been normalized. So that they have been, in that case, divided by the median number of students within each alliance. So for Erasmus+, it's students at the bachelor and master level, while for Horizon 2020 at the PhD level. So yeah, we can see that some alliances like ECU and Enhance, Civica had a relatively strong collaboration in both Horizon and Erasmus+. Others like Neurotech and or Eurotech have stronger ties in Horizon than in Erasmus. And we have also some cases where ties in Erasmus+ were stronger than in Horizon 2020, like in the alliances For Them or Engage EU. But I would also like to emphasize here that we only consider in these studies, in this study, Horizon 2020 and Erasmus+. There are, of course, other programs that we haven't considered and where certain alliances may have a strong history of collaboration. I am thinking notably of about the Creative Europe for alliances that are, for example, focusing on media and arts. So we have also looked into the membership of partner institutions in pre-existing alliances, as some share some common memberships. And as you probably all know, some of the alliances come directly from pre-existing alliance, like ECUN from ECU, the UFE from which come mainly from Jerung, the network of young research universities. We also saw a few minutes ago the Aurora Alliance. And in other cases, we see a combination of 2 or more memberships. And just as an example, we can cite the Unites Alliance, where we find mostly members of the cluster and CESAR networks. Yeah. So I will give it back to Agata.
Thank you. Georg, you can move on to the next slides. Thank you. Just as mentioned a moment ago by Marco, we wanted to come back to the geographical characteristics. So a small number of alliances share similar geographical position, the mid-sized cities, for example, but 17 out of 18 alliances which mention the geography on their websites or the fact sheets have reflected on their composition in terms of balance, regional diversity, and Europe-wide coverage. And so we categorize those as evidence of complementaries. It seems to us that the scheme is succeeding in terms of achieving a geographical balance overall, unlike perhaps some other programs where participation and budget distribution have been uneven in the past. As a participation in the initiative is proportional to the sector size in the participating countries. So we compared the participation to the number or the size, number of institutions and the size of all the participating countries. Further, though, the individual alliances appear to be balanced. That is, they include member institutions from at least 3 parts of Europe, and 26 include institutions from all Western, Northern, Southern, and Eastern parts. And from what we've seen, the newly invited or newly applying institutions joining existing alliances seem to be adding to the balance as well. As a summary then, on our last slide, we've combined the quantitative and qualitative results. And our analysis indicates that, perhaps not surprisingly, as we already discussed after the first presentation, most of alliances are built by similar institutions which share a often long history of collaboration, be it in research, education, or at whole institution level. And so for many, it might be reinforcing or taking the past collaborations to a new level. But for several alliances, there appears to have been new connections created as an effect of the initiative. And the Venn diagram here illustrates that all 3 mechanisms have been appearing or have been at play in almost half, or exactly 18 of the alliances. The complementarities, which I mentioned early on, appear most common and leading to most successful outcomes in the private sector alliances. They have only become visible to us in the European universities through the qualitative analysis. And coming back to my previous slide, these related predominantly to the geographical balance, which can be perhaps seen as a direct result of how the calls have been framed. And so further steps may need to be taken in the future to encourage building up of other complementarities in the alliances. And before we turn to the couple of questions or discussion points, we should again stress the complementarity of our study with others. So that's conducted at University of Oslo, where the researchers talked to some key figures in the alliances. We have been speaking with the consortium, which will be organizing the large-scale evaluation of the alliances. So we're sharing our work with them. We are aware, of course, of the study by Ben Youngblood and colleagues about the funding in higher education, which is of great relevance. And we were very happy to find out that Serious Academic is using ETER data to build their service to help institutions not currently in alliances to find a good match in the future. So we certainly see this as just the beginning. And on the final slide, in a similar fashion to the first session, we would like to ask you how you interpret the evidence on formation of the alliances, and if you maybe have suggestions of what further analysis could be useful, and maybe even suggesting some other complementary sources that haven't yet been mentioned or that we have not considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Agata and Marco, for this presentation that opens other perspectives on our discussion. So again, I will leave the speakers of the roundtable free to discuss according to their reactions to the data presented, their interpretation of the data, and also reflections on data needs for the future. as we have been discussing in the previous roundtable, this is becoming a serious challenge on our table. So again, thank you for accepting our invitation to discuss. Karen, Max, please. And apologies for the probably wrong pronunciation of your.
That's no problem. It's good enough. So I will bring my statement. Huh? That's the idea, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. Also, although it is digital, but anyhow. I'm rector at the University of Amsterdam until very recently also a chair of the LERU. Before moving to the questions, I would like to share my appreciation for the work undertaken and also for all the presentations we got already. I think this is a very nice afternoon to discuss with each other. And personally, I do believe that the European universities or the initiative has a large impact and can have a large impact on the European higher education area. And that would go, in my view, beyond the Bologna process. And I will come to that in a few minutes. Let me see. I would like to highlight two characteristics of the alliances. It's as just shown, the composition of a good number of the alliances is diverse. And brings together different types of institutions in terms of size, in terms of specialization, research intensity, and geographical coverage. So I think that in itself makes it a very important experiment and relevant experiment. And this offers a range of opportunities for creating proof of principles for the new instruments and for education. But I think what we need, and it is already a success so far, in a sense that there is a lot of appetite to do all these studies. But what I am missing at this moment is what a further strategy is. And this is something that we have to think about very soon. I think we know that with the strong role of digitalization in these processes, and also with the enormous democratization effect that these collaborations could have, we really are, my battery. Okay, I have a problem with my battery. I'll go, I hope it still will work. I'm connected though, but this doesn't work. Sorry about that. I think it's important to really look at that and see how we can bring this thing even much further than we are now. If we are really going to see this project as an instrument to bring more flexibility in the choices that students have for creating a curriculum, then we'd really do something which goes beyond Bologna. And that means that we really have to look at it in a different way. For instance, with in the digital world, you can add the access to other universities is much larger, and you can add curricula or parts of curricula in your own scheme. And if we find a way also to respect that and to bring that also as a part of the education program of the then that would really be a super super for also the democratization of our education. So I do believe in that, and that's also one of the reasons that we are so active in our alliance. The question that I was supposed to answer is, how do you interpret the evidence on the mechanisms of alliance formation? I'll do that first. First observation is that indeed it's surprising that out of the three mechanisms, the pre-existing network ties, similarities, and complementarity emerge as predominant mechanisms in shaping the first generations of alliances. In the context of LERU, we are 17 out of 23 LERU members as a partner, and we are that said, we are looking beyond the tangible data used for the analysis you have shown there, and there is much more to see. For example, while some alliances include several partners from an existing network, the focus of the collaborative activities within the alliance may completely be different. For example, universities that are members of a pre-existing network focusing on research may now be working together on joint educational offerings. And I think that's an important asset, and that also brings not only research, but also the education on the right level in at the university. Our own experience in the University of Amsterdam is that while we are a member of the Epicure Alliance, which includes 2 other LERU universities, we are getting to know these partners also in a very different constellation, in a very different way, now that we are working on mobilities and joint educational offerings. So even if we are already in a network, the focus of these networks and these alliances are very different, and that in itself is very interesting. And of course, also the wealth of information we share with the other members has been very enlightening for us. The second question was what further analysis should be done in relation to alliance formation and with which data? That's a difficult question, I personally find. It's obvious that an obvious thought that comes to mind in the current phase is that we look at the expansion of the alliances. It's the majority of first and second generation alliances decided to expand with 1 or more members, and it would be very interesting to analyze that process and gain insights from that. Another feature that may be worthwhile looking at is whether there will be an increase in network ties, because of course that's important between the alliance members. There are partners in our alliance, that we did not have before, and as University of Amsterdam, and so we did not have exchange contacts with Erasmus before, but we're now considering also to sign new Erasmus contracts with the alliance partners. So also there you see an explosion in how the interaction and the collaboration is growing. Similarly, it could also be interesting to observe whether alliance partners will intensify collaboration in applying for instance, the European grants and so far. So that's, I think, the most important that I would like to bring in. Maybe a final suggestion that may go beyond our scope, but I would still like to mention is that we could look into the mobility flows in a greater detail. After all, the alliances are expected to significantly boost the mobility of students and staff. And if alliances are successful, a wealth of data will become available for everyone. So that's important also. Also, future studies could look at patterns in the mobilities, for example, mobilities between different types of higher education institutions, mobilities between different regions in Europe, and so on and so forth. So thank you, and I look forward to the further discussion.
Thank you, Karen. for these comments. I think there will be a lot of discussion at the end. So I just leave the floor immediately to Gabi Lombardo. Gabi, please.
Hi, thanks, Andrea, and especially thanks for this workshop. It's extremely interesting and perfect time since there have been discussion about evaluation of the European University Alliance initiatives and from what perspective the evaluation should be done and with which data in particular and with which perspective. I'm the director of the European Alliance of Social Science Humanities, as you mentioned, which is a very young alliance of not just university, but also disciplinary associations. And we deliberately actually didn't do anything. When the pilot was discussed, we were in the room when we had the commission had the very first brainstorming on the initiatives, but we did not engage into soliciting our members to participate because it was beyond the scope of the alliance or the reason why ISH was built, which was more an interface between social science and humanities researchers and the science policies environment at large, but with a specific focus on research funding at both national and European level. I'm an outsider, although I have an involvement in all this because I've been invited in several discussions on the European University initiatives the Commission has organized, and I've been also a reviewer of some of these alliances in the making. And this is one point, the alliances, the original policy of this European University Initiative alliances was about education. So mobility and education exchanges programs, shared programs, and so on, give the student the experience of being taught in different places. But there was a later top up, let's say, of funding with some research funds for the alliances, which actually were enough to fund all of them, but I understand but two didn't make the cut. So it's actually also quite interesting how things are developed in the policy history. My first observation is one of the things that I see from the data is what we could call it a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, obviously, the policy, the way has the European University Initiative was designed, was to achieve exactly what it has achieved. That means that universities that were already involved in network were quickly informed, that they were informed before, they lobbied for this, and they found themselves at the front for participating and contributing into the bids, in the call, and therefore to actually have a successful result. So in some sort of ways, that was the first fulfilling prophecy. The second one was very much the design. It was meant to encourage university to exchange students. So those who were on a larger scale, had better resources, could obviously prepare immediately programs which were contributing to that purpose, and so forth. I mean, there are several other points in which the data kind of match perfectly or match well enough what the original design of this policy was in terms of let these collaborations going. Maybe the only kind of smaller result was in the collaboration between West and East, where still there's been some difficulty, as Sebastian was mentioning earlier. The numbers are quite interesting, and this might be the only sort of aspect in which the policy didn't completely fulfill what the result of the data now show. So this is a kind of be careful what we wish for. So one of the data that would be interesting for me to see it, but this is a personal perspective, and this is a way I do think, is also the application they failed and why they failed. I mean, for me, it seems to be quite interesting to see always at the other side of the box. Since I was a child, I always had turned the box upside down to see what is underneath it. And so what are the alliances they applied originally in the first and the second round? And the criteria changes slightly between the first and second round. What are the ones they failed and why they failed for? What were the major weaknesses? Because that tells also how the policy was interpreted, and not just by the applicants, but also by the reviewers, so those who actually had to award the alliances in particular. And I think that's kind of interesting because also the brief the reviewer received, which was perfectly in line most likely with what this initiative is trying to achieve, kind of set the path for the result that you're getting now with this data. And I found extremely interesting the whole discussion about diversity. And it's actually very true that there's a huge diversity of institutions across Europe. So another aspect that is interesting, actually, this is a thought that I share with Sebastian, because it's what if a university didn't get it? And this was a conversation we had a few days ago about it. And this is exactly the point. Another element, interesting element, is to see universities which are similar and having a similar trend historically up to the point of the university alliances. One got the alliances grant, one didn't. What would be the difference? So as someone hypothesized earlier, in big university, maybe the funding wouldn't make any difference whatsoever. But in smaller, medium-sized or smaller universities or institutions, may have had a bigger impact. So that will also allow you to scale and to understand the different level of impact compared to the type of institution you analyze. So this is the other element of the data that I thought would be interesting to look at, how the storytelling will go if we keep everything the same, so the same national policy development, but how a university in or out of the alliances would ever react. And if to see also, because this is another of my obsession, sorry, as a very personal, which is more a natural trend of things that they go on a track, or is the policy they change? And what is the policy? Is the European policy they change the track, or is the national policy had a bigger impact or big effect? So compare where one or the other, or as Ben was saying earlier, the fact that some national government have directly invested into these alliances. So again, this is another element of discrimination and diversity, which could give you another nuance and another range of shades to the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabby. Again, other dimensions added to our discussion and the self-fulfilling prophecy issue. Let's discuss. Next one is Ludovic Tilly, that you already know from previous discussion. He's the coordinator of European Campus of Cities and the chair of Coimbra Group. Please, Ludovic.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon once again. And of course, I'm delighted to be with you all, in particular with our distinguished panel members and all the colleagues from the alliances and beyond this afternoon for this very interesting discussion, because indeed it is really timely to take the time to look at what data can tell us about the alliances and what we can do with this instrument, because I believe this is the way to see it. It is an instrument to go further, as many have said, including Karen just before. I would like this afternoon to maybe provide, let's say, 3 viewpoints, taking stock of, let's say, my several responsibilities. I will start with, let's say, the Coimbra Group view, which is a large-scale network that I will briefly present, and how it has been engaged in this initiative. Then I will speak as a coordinator with the EC2E Alliance and how we actually prepared the creation of this alliance. And basically you will see that what you have presented as the first data overview is very much in line with many of the components you described. And I will then, if all my colleagues allow, to I will present let's say supra-alliance viewpoint, being the chair of the 4EU2, which is the informal group of the 24 alliances selected in 2020. And I know that my colleague Emily Palmer, right after me, will bring also the voice of the group of the first 17 alliances, the 4EU1. So basically 3 levels of comments on my side. Starting with the Coimbra Group, I was mentioning before, this is actually the oldest association of universities in Europe. It has been founded in 1985. At that time, the very initial purpose was to create a network that would foster mobility within the universities. So we are talking about 1985. And actually the Commission at that time heard about this initiative and created 2 years later the first Erasmus program. So basically, it shows that once again, universities have been at the forefront of innovation, and this is what we're doing at Coimbra Group. And since then, of course, many other associations have been created. Today, the Coimbra Group is composed of 41 universities that are comprehensive, education and research led. So they would, I think, fit in the red color that you were presenting in the graph before. Correct me if I'm wrong. And these 41 universities are from 23 European countries, gathering 1.5 million students, about 230,000 staff. And they have been very high in the, let's say, the rankings of well, many types of rankings, but here the one I want to refer to is the one associated to the number of Erasmus student mobility, not more than that. The other point which I wanted to say here is that actually Coimbra Group has been probably for this long existence involved since day one in this initiative, being a permanent member of the so-called stakeholder group at the Commission. This has been true during what has been called the initiative design. So we are here talking about the 2018-2019 period. And last year and the year before in the future rollout consultation process, where actually major stakeholders, but also alliances themselves and the member states have been included. So this very strong engagement led to the fact that today, over the 41 university members, there are 36 that are officially involved in 8 alliances selected under the pilot phase, and we could expect probably more with the now awaited feedback or results from the new call that was published earlier this year, and that the other one which will be published next year. These 8 alliances are 4EU+, Arcus, Charmi-U, Circle-U, EC2U, Enlight, Uniwell, and Una Europa. Charmi-U and EC2U are actually 2 alliances that are fully composed of Coimbra Group members. Some of them are also members of other networks, but really one of the, let's say, common belonging to another association or consortium, let's say, is related to the Coimbra Group. And this very strong link between the Coimbra Group and the alliances has led also that the Coimbra Group is now officially associated partner to 4, and in the next period, 5 or even maybe 6 alliances, Charmi-U, Circle-U, EC2U, Una Europa, during the pilot phase. And this mutual engagement has been already transformed into some, let's say, events and multiplier events, for instance, where we are regularly organizing public workshop on alliances. And actually there was one last week during the annual conference of the Coimbra Group in Padova. And we have invited these 8 alliances to come and to present actually their activities in relation to what was the topic of the annual conference, public conference, which was academic values. It was indeed in the context of the 800th anniversary of the University of Padova. And indeed, we all considered that this topic of the academic freedom, academic values was something to be very importantly shared and discussed, especially looking at how these values and freedoms can be threats in the current world and developments. And the 8 alliances really had to show their most interesting activities related to the dissemination of European values and also linked with society. And it was very interesting to see that there are differences, but also there are really shared values. This is interesting because it also means that in terms of your questions today, there is a very important aspect related to qualitative data, not just indeed the quantitative, which can really inform us a lot about what is making the cement, the glue between these institutions in alliances. So these are, let's say, the Coimbra Group views on this. If I now look at, as a coordinator of an alliance, how we actually somehow use the data to create the mission statement and the whole nature of our alliance, we started, of course, we knew each other for a long time because we were all partners in the Coimbra Group. So of course, this trust-based long-term relationship is really helpful. And we heard already before some comments on how indeed you can really go quicker, deeper when you have this existing cooperation. But of course, there are many ways to interact, and this is clearly not the single model. But when we prepared our work plan to really, let's say, base our future activities on very strong values, but also I would say markers that we knew were, let's say, a sign that we could really fulfill our commitments and join really together in a concrete manner. We basically looked at two sets of data. First, the European projects. And here I refer to the Erasmus project, Key Action 2, etc., but also the framework program, so basically Horizon 2020 and the programs before. And we, from our internal data archives, we could see that within the period 2009-2018, altogether, the 7 universities, we had already more than 600 European projects, a large part of them being partly shared within the consortium. So that was already a first set of very important data. But of course, we wanted to really focus our alliance on goals related to research. So therefore, what we did is we actually contracted with Elsevier to really help us digging into the SciVal and other type of databases to see how we could identify joint research articles. And on the same period, 2009-2018, we actually discovered, and I purposely discovered because we were clearly not aware of all this great wealth of research cooperation. We knew the topics, but not all the small individual articles. And over that period of about 10 years, we had more than 1,220 joint papers within the 7 universities. So these two data sets really helped us preparing our work plan that is at the same time based on cooperation, education, and in research. And we selected some first topics related to SDGs. I will not go into the details. The third part, third viewpoint that I would like to bring is now this time more, let's say, on behalf of the 24 alliances. And I think that what I will briefly present here is probably also common to the first 17. This is related actually to their Horizon 2020 Science with and for Society SWAFS projects that has been, this was an additional opportunity offered to the alliances, as you all know. And the different alliances have applied to this call for proposal, proposing activities in relation to so-called transformation modules related to research and innovation. And among these potential joint activities, because this SWAFS project were mostly policy capacity building, let's say, not really research activities per se. We can really, when we compare the different projects, this is an exercise we've done for you too, and clearly we see that we find a joint R&I agenda, new metrics in research assessment, new peer review methods, better recognition of SSH and artistic research, for instance, gender equality in research, career development, open and citizen science. And these aspects are actually very difficult to grasp through data in particular. And even within a single alliance, to really develop this capacity building in joint R&I activities requests a lot of internal data analysis, which is clearly not easy. So as one of the questions was how can we also think of additional type of data? I think that clearly shows that the alliances, and this is my opinion, do need massive data analysis indeed to help them going really quickly forward in this analysis of potential RNI activities. And we also see that this data, and probably provided by ETHER, could help a lot in making very fast progress in the inter-partner cooperation within the single alliances. So we see that clearly additional data and new indicators are needed, probably also in relation to the latest policy developments. And here I have in mind in particular the reform of research assessment. Of course, if there are new metrics in the research assessment, the same type of new metrics should appear in the data analysis related to alliance activities. So I will stop here, and yeah, I'm ready for your further discussions.
Yeah, thank you, Ludovic. Thank you very much. Again, other dimensions of discussion about the last comment on qualitative data, very, very interesting. Let's ask Emily to take the microphone and to conclude the round table, please.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And indeed, thank you to the organizers and all the contributors today. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, bringing so many different perspectives, which of course makes it more rich overall. I have to say, I don't wear quite as many hats as the previous speaker, Ludovic, but I will do my very best to bring some perspectives to the table. First and foremost from Una Europa, which is the alliance that I represent, but of course also representing here today the first 17 alliances that were selected. Of course, it's always difficult to be the last speaker. There are so many things that have been said already, and I have to say on the whole, I fully agree with what my colleagues have said so far, but I'll try to bring some novelties now to the discussion. So first of all, when it comes to the mechanisms of alliance formation that you have looked into, I think it's really interesting to, as some previous speakers said, look into how the alliances have and are growing. The announcement of the European Commission, I think it was last April of last year, that there would be very big financial incentives for universities to grow specifically to 9 members, has made a very quick move well, it's changed the landscape again of higher education institutions, both at the level of alliances trying to seek new partners, but also at the level of partners outside of the alliances trying to knock on the door of alliances saying, let me in, let me in. This has been a very interesting thing to watch. But what we can learn from that, at least from the perspective of Una Europa, we have grown from 8 institutions now to 11 higher education institutions. And we went through a very long, well, a very important process of due diligence to select and discuss with our new member institutions and indeed others before coming to a conclusion. And what was absolutely clear in this process is that the values of the institutions that we wanted to engage and bring on board our alliance were absolutely key. They had to be shared values of those universities already within Una Europa so that we could see a long-term commitment to the future and build trust. And of course, the caliber of the university, the level of excellence and their size were also important measures here, because in order to be able to collaborate in depth, there does need to be some similarity of the institutions in question. When it comes to pre-existing network ties, the previous 3 speakers have focused a lot on the networks that universities are already involved in at institutional level. This is all very important, and I agree, but I'd like to turn it around and bring a novelty and take it from the bottom-up academic perspective. So what's absolutely clear is if you want these alliances to run and be successful in the long run, it's not going to be only the top-down approach that's important, but perhaps even more importantly, that academics drive, run, and lead the European university moving forward. And in order for these academics to want to collaborate within the framework, those pre-existing network ties are absolutely clear. And let's be clear as well that our academics, as well as our institutions, are open to the world. So we're looking much broader than EU or Erasmus partners in this case, to also include the broader landscape of the higher education area in Europe, most importantly, the UK and Switzerland, which bring among the strongest universities in Europe, both in terms of research output, but also in terms of educational offerings. And as Una Europa, we have actually a UK and a Swiss member, the University of Edinburgh and the University of Zurich, that have joined us recently at the level of our alliance. And what's really important, I think, moving forward when it comes to the analysis is maybe to look beyond the EU instrument, because what we might see in a few years from now is those 8 institutions at UK which are engaging in alliances, and which I believe will continue to engage in alliances, might drop off your mapping because they no longer receive funding from Erasmus, but yet they're going to continue to be very strong contributors and benefactors of the European Universities Initiative and of those alliances as a whole. So that's really important. The third point on complementarity, I think everyone understands that on the one hand, the world is getting more complex, but on the other hand, research is becoming more and more specialized, and a single researcher, a single department, a single university will never be able to respond to those very large questions that we have in front of us. So in order to confront those challenges, we need collaboration. We need collaboration internationally and across sectors. There's naturally going to be complementarity when you work across international borders. And what these alliances really provide, I think, is the opportunity for working in an interdisciplinary way as well. So when it comes to further analysis, I think it would be really important to focus on the openness of these alliances to working with the world, to look into how these alliances are collaborating more broadly in Europe beyond the Erasmus and Horizon programs, specifically with the UK and Switzerland, but also how they're collaborating more broadly in the world. We see some alliances that are focusing, for instance, on collaboration with Africa, and others that are working more in Latin America, perhaps in China. I think this is really important if we want to look to the impact of these alliances. And I end with a note that I think it would be important to move beyond looking at the formation and the growth of these alliances at some point to what is their actual impact. And there I couldn't agree more with the comments of Ben earlier and also in the chat, that we need to move beyond quantitative data to real qualitative data. And of course would be very willing to continue the discussion on that. Thank you very much.
Great, Emily. You already have appreciation on the chat. Great. So we have time. We have time. That's not obvious because very often webinars are full of talks by the invited speakers and no room for discussion. We have time for a broad conversation that might be of interest to everybody. So take the microphone and let's continue the discussion after the second roundtable, please. Sebastian, please.
Okay, so I've already spoken, Andrea, but maybe
don't worry. Don't worry. If you talk too much, I will cut you.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
No, I think there are some things which I find very interesting as well in the presentations which were just made about how the European alliances were created and emerged. Maybe there's a bit of serendipity which isn't mentioned. So in my experience, actually, most of the alliances and most of the members really emerged by complete chance. So one president gets on well with another rector, phones him and says, hey, do you want to come on board? To meet and have one says, hey, you speak German. Oh, that's wonderful. Come with us. We'll forget about the other member. And I really know dozens, I'd almost say hundreds of cases like this. And I think that what happens is that actually most of these alliances have really emerged in that manner and often in complete panic. So in some cases, a university has said, there's this alliance, we have to participate, we need 8 partners. So who do we get? I've got this contact, and this person has that contact, and they come together. And then we use data to analyze this and to build a story. And this is where we've got the story building, data and evidence-based storytelling. And it's great. It's not a criticism. And from that, then you start creating an identity, and the identity becomes real. So 2 years or 3 years further down, then this really becomes a true alliance. But I think that in a way, we're often using the data and evidence to build these stories. It doesn't make them less powerful. It doesn't make the alliances less meaningful. But I think that we're often creating this a posteriori. Not all cases, but I think in many cases. And here I'd add in a second element, which is the question of the policy objectives. I find it's very interesting because actually, seen from the outside, I'd say that the policy objectives have never been rendered explicit because they cannot be rendered explicit. So the true policy objective is transfer of sovereignty over higher education away from nation states to Europe. But that cannot be said. So in a way, we're the beginning of the 20-year process, like with Bologna and Erasmus on the one hand and the framework programs on the other for research and for higher education, but at an institutional level. But we cannot say it. So of course, we find ourselves building these stories and this data to answer objectives which are not the true objectives. And here it's very interesting, and Michael was comparing the approaches between Europe and the US and China and saying, well, there's this question of distributed excellence, and Andrea, you posted your article on it. And I think that this is only partly true. So there is an element, but I think that the real reason why European universities are key is because the difference between the US and the Chinese systems is not so much a difference in models and hierarchies, but it's a difference in level of integration at a national scale and difference between national systems. And so it's through the European universities that we're beginning to address these deep institutional questions, which again will take at least 20 years to tackle, hopefully. So I just wanted to bring in those couple of elements into the discussion.
Yes, very interesting. Sebastian, given that we can also discuss about, let's say, analytic approaches to the alliances and the evolution of higher education, we should remember that in the 70s, some of the most important studies by sociologists of higher education exactly stated that objectives of universities are never fully described. They are often ambiguous, and ambiguity comes from the extreme complexity and the need to make the alignment of different perspectives and stakeholders. So we shouldn't expect a fully rational, top-down, crystal clear kind of objectives, neither from the Commission or governments or even institutions. So adding more complexity to the picture is okay. We are prepared to examine that. I saw another hand that comes from Ludovic, if I'm not wrong.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted actually to respectfully oppose to what Sebastian just said. We are all academics, so we can indeed have discussions and debates, right? No, the reason I'm saying this is because, of course, what you have said could be true, but we should be very careful in making a very strong difference between what an alliance has as a mission statement, and indeed what are the goals that are 5, 10, even maybe 50 years ahead, and what we alliances have been obliged to put on the paper for being funded for 3 years. Basically, I'm saying this differently. You can have, and I'm pretty sure that this is the case for most alliances, that the alliances really wanted to build something very important together. But when you have to basically fulfill the constraints on the call for proposal, where there is underfunding, but at the same time, very high expectations, you have no choice but to look at the data to build what you consider as a potentially successful work plan for being selected, but above all, for being successful at the end of the project, and then be again funded, etc. In other words, I don't think that this is true, at least in all cases, and I can tell you at least one alliances, and I know there are more, where the alliances has not been created by a series of phone calls between people who know bilaterally, but really people that came around the table and say, we want to be part of that, we have a long-term project, but because we are unfortunately on the funded, on the short time funding, and this unfortunately will probably continue for some period of time, which, by the way, I would like to say that this is again a very important problem that all alliances are facing. We had no choice but then indeed to look down to the data to propose successful work plans. And this is really this actually tension, which is a problem, because at the same time, we're asking the alliances to solve very big issues related to the Bologna process, related to attractivity and competitiveness of Europe, but at the same time, funded on the project-based approach. And of course, this makes the story very, very difficult.
Thank you, Ludovic. I feel the temperature of the conversation rising. That's wonderful. I see Karen with the hand. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. But I want to bring it from a different view, a little different view, because this is not a collaboration between countries. This is not a collaboration between universities. This is a collaboration between people of education programs. And the problem that I see is that it's very hard to bridge all those levels on top of each other. And actually, we should have very simple, because it's for almost no money that we're doing this. So a little spark is enough to bring this together. So I wonder whether we should not in Europe make sure that we can broaden this over the whole, over other education programs, other initiatives, and so forth and so forth, because this could make us very, very strong. And it is because we are living in a digital world that this is possible to a great extent. So I see we have to make sure that we don't forget the initiatives of the people who are in the education programs and who are making these connections. And that's not on the country level, that's not on the European level, that's not even on the university level.
Thank you, Karen. I see many approval on your point on the chat. That's very interesting. I see other two hands. One is Gabi, and the other I have to see. Gabi, please.
Yeah, just following up on what Professor Miles was saying about a collaboration of individuals, which make also a point of sustainability of the alliances and the strength. And that's, I mean, I completely side what Ludovic was saying, that this alliance came up of a previous and already established network, because the funding were not so relevant to make the difference to an extent. And as a consequence, is a collaboration of people on education programs. And we know collaboration of people could be fluid in a sense that is for as long as you have a core committed group of people, but people come and go in institutions and universities more than anywhere else. So sustainability is another perspective, and that's why national policies are very interesting in this perspective. As Ben was saying, they are invested or co-invested in the initiative to see what the endpoint, and as Professor Meiser was mentioning earlier, the future, the purpose of this organization, these alliances.
But can I answer to that?
Please, Karen, please.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to take the whole time, but do we want a Europe with universities and alliances? Or do we want a Europe with a new type of Bologna process where we enable all universities and to offer these alliances? Because then you can leave it with the people who are working with it. And it would be a great asset for our youngsters, for our students to be able to do that.
Hey, Karen, great question. Andreas, please.
Yes, hello, Andreas Ragaz, University of Graz, and as such member of the ACUS Alliance. Karen, you mentioned before, I think, or Gabi, you was it, that alliances are built upon teachers, so people who teach in joint programs. At least in the ACUS Alliance, we have also a very strong tool or pillar on common research and joint research. And therefore, we are trying, and this is underlined two times, to build up a research community within our alliance. And that's a very, very interesting, but a long time taking effort to get the researchers together to apply successfully in, for example, Horizon Europe projects or common papers and so on. And I think, and that's my input, we or the ITER consortium should be aware what the indicators are measuring in this respect, because oftentimes these indicators on EU funds or publications need another form of collaboration between researchers than it is necessary or occurs within alliances. So maybe, for example, for the ESC grants, research with a strong focus on SWAF or on transdisciplinarity isn't honored in that manner, then pure research is there. Or on the other side, within alliances, there's a strong focus on science with society and for society, but you get in most cases ESC grants therefore. So when alliances were measured with, for example, ESC grants and are they rising, that's not the intention of an alliance itself. So just be aware of these aspects. Thanks.
Thank you, Andres. Emily, please.
Yeah, thank you. So it just occurs to me that we've spoken a lot this afternoon about, you know, the European Universities Initiative not just benefiting the few, and you know, those universities are perhaps, yeah, more advanced, richer, more resource intensive, more research intensive, etc. But I would like to go back to my point about measuring in the future the openness of the alliances, because from Una Europa, and I think that many alliances will agree with this, that it's not going to be necessarily by increasing the number of alliances, 17, 41, 60, we keep going, that we're going to, I mean, we're never going to reach all higher education institutions in Europe. But if each alliance has a specific role with its diverse, unique profile in transforming one part of the higher education area as a whole, and working with other institutions, being open to working with other institutions outside of their alliance or alliances in general, this could indeed have a much bigger impact. So I think it would be really important in the future to measure how open the alliances are to working with others, and to, in the models that they work on, in the formats that they're developing, that there's the potential to scale up much broadly across Europe, but also indeed across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. That's another very interesting perspective, Emily. Ludovic.
Yeah, quick comment to, well, first, I would like, of course, to support what Emily just said, but I think that the potential impact of the alliances will not just be measured by their openness. We should also somehow measure to what degree the other stakeholders have agreed to listen to what the alliances have to say. And here I have specifically in mind that a lot of the current barriers in the higher education system in Europe are related to its very strong regulation heterogeneities. In particular, and we, I guess, all have in mind the famous future European degree. Whether or not it will exist is actually not the question here, but actually to what degree all what the current alliances have already identified as barriers to really promote joint curricula, joint teaching and learning offerings, to what degree are these barriers going to be solved by the policymakers? Otherwise, this will be a nice, very nice bubble in the time and space of the European history, but this will go nowhere. And this is really a critical point at the moment. I mean, we can have indeed hundreds of alliances created in Europe. If the member states do not agree to sit around the table and finally apply the Bologna process in all its positive aspects, we will just go nowhere.
Thank you, Ludovic. Marik, please.
Well, thank you and good afternoon to everybody. Great pleasure to listen to this very interesting conversation. I would like to agree with Karen that it's very important to think about how change actually emerges and progresses. And I think it has to do with the concept of a network or an alliance. And for me, that's still a question when I look at the European University Initiative. What is actually the underlying concept of a network? Mostly, I would say in terms of its agency. And I think there Karen is very, very right. And my view on change to happen in higher education is that the agencies should preferably be with those elements of the organization that are the manifold. And that's usually the students. And the proof is Erasmus, which basically gave students so much agency that the dynamics that created, I think, led to the Bologna process to happen at all. So I think we should think about what a network is, what our concept is. And the whole idea of institutional networks of entire universities, I would say is not at all obvious. Because especially in education, and it's been said by many colleagues that this European University Initiative was foremost geared towards education. Change in higher education does not happen through university or institutional structures. They're actually mostly, or more often, I would say, an obstacle to change. They happen through networks, and there's emerging very good literature on social network analysis, providing very, very good evidence and very good theory for that. So the interpersonal contexts and interactions, I would like to underline that that point that Karen has made. And of course, in a digital world, that's you know, that's such an immense opportunity. And the second point, also in line with what has been, I think, mentioned here and there, is cost. And if we need any more data or any data further, I would say, well, cost benefit analysis and added value analysis, because what I see around me, the efforts are immense and the costs as well. And the funding is not in line, of course. So I would also suggest that kind of analysis. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. I'm asking whether there is a final question, just urgent. Otherwise, we move towards some conclusions. Let me check. We will need a few minutes to try to identify some directions for further work, and then I think leave the final word to Yamael. No, that's okay. Thank you. Very lively discussion from a variety of perspectives. I cannot summarize, but let me put 5 points in the agenda. First, attention to the context in terms of government policy supporting or not supporting alliances, changes in the regulatory environment, for example, very simply in terms of joint degrees and courses taught in English, funding, autonomy of universities. So we need to put in the future monitoring of alliances a lot of context. Second, heterogeneity. Heterogeneity across alliances. Many people have raised attention on the diversity of alliances in terms of topic, reason, mission, and so on and so forth. So we need probably develop some typology or some work to describe and classify different kind of alliances, and also heterogeneity within the alliance. So the intra-alliance kind of diversity in terms, again, of typology of institutions, age, size, subject mix, and then PhD versus non-PhD kind of institutions. Here, what is interesting is that we could leverage on a large literature that we've been working on diversity. Diversity in alliances, a huge literature in strategic management, or diversity in scientific disciplines, a huge literature on interdisciplinarity and kind of diversity. So we could apply a lot of knowledge developed in social sciences on diversity to describe and measure the diversity both across and within alliances. Number 3, performance and impact. Many people believe it's time to be more explicit about what we expect from alliances. And again, a large range of opinion come out about what kind of performance can we expect and whether performance is enough. And we want more, from performance to outcome or to impact. And again, here we distinguish between performance of the alliance, and then we have discussion about increasing the number of new members, or strengthening the ties, or any kind of performance of the network underlying the alliance, or other kind of performance in education, in mobility, even in research. And here, other distinctions are important, whether we expect a transformative potential versus incremental, whether we want explicit goals that that put performance under a clear or more rational kind of process versus kind of more bottom-up in which processes in which performance is as multidimensional and can take different directions, not exactly perfectly anticipated by the actors themselves. So here, what will be performance? How do we define? How do we measure? How do we track the change in performance? And how do we use performance as a condition for more profound impact in society? It seems to be another dimension of research and monitoring for the future observatory. The distributed excellence model has been mentioned repeatedly, and the issue of strategy, whether we have a strategy, or whether we have strategy as emergent, as something that is not perfectly top-down clarified, but may be created in the interaction between several layers of institutions and actors. Number 4, the governance of alliances. Many people have raised attention on the need for flexibility, alliance versus network, whether the number of people in the alliance, the number of institutions is relevant, whether we see a sort of square law of increasing complexity when you increase the number of members, and whether it is a problem we should investigate. So in a sense, the issue of governance of alliances. And number 5 in my reading is also a call for more granular data. So a call for exploiting better existing data, integrating data, and developing new ones. So for example, existing data, there has been a call for more granular data on disciplines and subject mix, which is already feasible for students using ether data. The issue of university PhD granting versus non-PhD granting institutions, again, something that is already there, but also integration between ether data, multi-rank, other institutional data provided by the European University Association and other sources that can be leveraged and integrated. And finally, the issue of qualitative data. That is, how do we get qualitative data from the documentation of alliances, from other documentation that can complement quantitative data. So from my perspective, in terms of, I repeat, context, heterogeneity, performance and impact, governance, and granularity of data, we got a very large number of suggestions, of critical remarks, also of elements that are, difficult to tackle in a sense. Not everything is already there and easy, but are extremely valuable for the future. So I think that Benedetto can add comments, and then we ask Commission to give us a final remark.
So thank you, Andrea. I must say it has been a real pleasure to listen for 3 hours, which shows how interesting and topical was the subject and how interesting were contribution. And first, I have really to thank Andrea for organizing this, the contributors and the panelists with your generous participation. And I really hope this will build the seed for further collaborations around this work. And then I have to thank Alessia and Georg, who were behind this event and organizing and mastering. I would say the importance of this kind of events shows also what data are for. So data don't provide conclusions. I was taught at the beginning of my academic career by Rémi Barré, the founder of the French Observatory of Science and Technology. But data are seeds for debate, and exactly because data are partial or imperfect, in a way, it's a virtue of data. If you were to come saying with ITER and other projects, we are all answers to the questions, we would have been closed the discussion in 15 minutes. Data allow to think in terms of alternatives, pathway, and that's the role. So we should really keep this interaction. Then something we must be aware, it was cited, is the importance of patterns of social reproduction in higher education. I disagree when it was said there is a lot of chance in the alliance formation. As a sociologist, it's not chance because you meet people in the same network, you meet people not exactly by chance. Sociology has shown us regularities. So there is a lot of this reproduction, and this is maybe invisible, but it's powerful as the data show. At the same time, I think it's well taken the point, the differences may be at deeper levels. For example, it was mentioned, even if you put together research universities, they might start cooperating on new curricula. So differences may be at deeper level, and this requires different types of analysis. And I do think this is very important for public policies to understand the limits to policy interventions. So policy intervention enter into a very hierarchized, stratified, organized higher education system with different contexts and types of institutions. And this will impact powerfully on which kind of alliances we do observe. So policy might look to the type of activities within alliances rather than to the type of alliances which are formed, for example. Then, of course, in a way, it's a good news. You can always say we need more data, but if we would have made this event 20 years ago, we would have had basically no data. So we need to measure the progress and the opportunities and the potential exploited by data complementarities. For example, Sebastian posted a link with Series Academic. They are combining data from different sources, ITER plus data from bibliometrics, data from qualitative data to observe alliances. So there is really a potential in exploiting current data and having them interoperable. And this speaks really that the strategy of the European Commission for the Higher Education Observatory of harmonizing rather than creating new data sets from scratch, it's probably a very good one. At the same time, I must warn that not always more data and more detailed data are good things, because sometimes just adding complexity will just obscure the main patterns and which are observed. So data are valuable to the extent they bring an added value and they bring space for debate. And I have a feeling we have so much now that we should maybe stop asking for more data and use seriously the data we have and combine them. My final point, which opens to Jan Mael, is as a policymaker, I would wonder how can policy develop a higher education policy for a so diverse system? So it was mentioned not one approach can fit all. Do we want to have a research university alliances only between research universities? Do we want to have different alliances and then which mechanism? Or this calls for a complexity of policy, which is typical of Europe and would require a reflection. It was said the first alliances were built on existing structures. Now this cannot go forever. So the future direction needs to find ways, instruments like alliances can provide some added value to this system. So overall, I felt this was a very intriguing and interesting debate, and I hope there will be places in the future for continuing it and for nurturing it from all sides with more data, more empirical evidence. And to close, I would like to ask Jan Mael whether you are still available and would you like to say a few concluding words?
Sure, Benedetto. I can try, but after you and Andrea, it's hard to find something else to say, since you've covered much better than I could do everything that was said during this very fascinating workshop. I think diversity came as really the key word. Diversity in terms of characteristics of alliances, of approaches, of data needs, of data sources. We heard a lot about ideas for new data, but then always the question comes on how to collect it. It's another question, especially qualitative data, without putting too much of a burden on those that are supposed to provide data, and maybe think about using data that are already available, but maybe not already combined with others in order to create indicators. One of the other key takeaway for me would be to not to have this message in mind, to not compare apple and pears, compare like with like. This came as a very strong message, of course, and the idea of any observatory would be to enable everyone using it actually to compare what can be compared, what's like with like, and not mix different objectives, different structures one with another, because that wouldn't make sense. On the question of performance and impact, well, I have to stress that the European University Initiative is a relatively new initiative, and therefore, all the data we have actually discussed today are based on data from 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So there are data on the start of the initiative, and it will take time before we can actually say something about, from data perspective, on the impact of what this initiative had on different levels. But then they need to be used. Any policy, any initiative needs to be evaluated at some point to see if it brought added value, to see if there needs to improve it, what worked best and what worked less. So data are always needed. But as you said, Benedetto, data do not provide conclusions. They only help actors to reach conclusions. And we think that that would be the objective of the observatory that we will aim at setting up next year, to provide policymakers at European level, of course, but also at national level, because they indeed may have slightly different priorities, to enable higher education themselves beyond also European universities, those participating to European university alliances, to reach their own conclusions, to compare themselves with others, and to help, I would add, the individuals, as it was mentioned several times, the individuals could use this observatory to just get to know more about different aspects of the higher education sector. And I would add one group that was less identified, that is the students. Knowing about your higher education institution is important for a student when it comes to make a choice that can impact the rest of your life. So we should keep them in mind. But the objective is certainly not to create some sort of rigid ranking of institutions or of alliances. That has never been the way the European Commission has worked, and that can be seen from the way we supported the development of the EU multi-rank tool, that it allows for much more flexibility, and that allows to compare what's comparable, but not to provide ranking, because our systems are just too diverse for that. And it's important to look at differences when comparing higher education institutions one with another, or systems one with another. So a lot of food for thought for us, and I will stop here. Thank you everyone for participating to this workshop. Thank you Benedetto, thank you Andrea, thank you Alessia for organizing this. And yeah, I'm looking forward to actually listen once again to this workshop afterwards, because I'm sure I can't remember everything that was said. It was so rich. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And with this, we close the session, and we wish you a good end of afternoon.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank
you.
Thank you all. Bye.